Comfortable, and we'll get started. First of all, I should check to see if things are working properly. Liz, can you hear me?
Again.
Great, thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 10th session in our Woodland Conferences webinar mini-series of 2021-22. My name is Don Cameron, and I'm a regional forester with the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables in Truro, and it's my pleasure to again be your MC for this event. In the spirit of meaningful reconciliation, we acknowledge our presence on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people in what is known today as Nova Scotia, a small part of Mi'kma'ki. The Treaty of Peace and Friendship of 1725 and subsequent treaties remain foundational to the relationship between the Mi'kmaq people and all Canadians. We are all treaty people. This conference mini-series is a variation of our annual Spring Woodland Conference series, which we've been organizing across the province annually for many years. Despite the pandemic, we're pleased to be able to continue to offer interesting and educational presentations this year in this online format. I'm happy to announce tonight that we will soon be hosting our first of 3 in-person conferences since before the pandemic. In fact, we've been planning for several months to hold the Central Region Conference Saturday, April 2nd. We will host the event in Millbrook, just outside of Truro. It will include many interesting Indigenous forest and land use related topics and speakers, including Gerald Glode, who some of you would be familiar with from previous events, and as an excellent speaker and educator. Other topics include ecological forestry, a Woodland Owner of the Year Award winners' experiences, ticks and Lyme disease, an update from the Deputy Minister of Natural Resources and Renewables, and the Family Forest Network, among others. The Western Region in-person conference will be April 23rd at the Forties Community Center in New Ross, and the Eastern Region event will be April 30th at the Port Hawkesbury Civic Center. All 3 conferences will be run according to existing COVID health restrictions. If after March 21st all health restrictions are dropped, masks will still be recommended for conference participants. Now, in terms of tonight, the format and then the platform that we're using, all participants are automatically muted and your video is turned off for the benefit of the presentations. Your names are invisible to each other, but visible to us, the event organizers. There will be opportunity for you to ask questions. There's a Q&A panel on the upper right side of your screen for those that are new to this, where you can post your questions. Just click on the arrow beside Q&A. You will be able to forward questions to us at any time. So during the presentation, if a question hits you, feel free to ask that question, or you can wait to the end, whatever you choose. At the end of the presentation, I will read the questions out to the presenter and they will answer them verbally. Depending on the number of questions, of course, we may not get to all of them during the time allotted, but our goal is to send out answers after the session today to anyone that we're unable to give answers to tonight. Any polling questions for you? Oh, we're not doing any polling tonight, so that doesn't matter. Please note that in case you would like to go back and review some part of this event, or if you know of somebody who's not able to be here tonight, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted online at nswoods.ca for future viewing. That's nswoods.ca for future viewing. The previous webinar sessions that we held and recorded, are now available online, and they include Forest Sector and Forestry Transition Team Update, Private Land Stewardship, Invasive Species and Forest Pests, Climate Change and Forest Carbon, Biodiversity, Wildlife and Species at Risk, Forestry Business Planning and Potential, Woodland Stewardship Planning, Pathways to Success, and the importance and role of lichens. The link for any and all of these recorded sessions is available again at nswoods.ca website. I should add that thus far there have been several hundreds of viewings of these recordings so far, so we're very pleased that they're being made use of. For today's session, we have almost 100 individuals registered. Note that the bios for today's speakers and any speaker handouts will be available through the same website. The format of tonight will consist of our presenters providing their presentation without interruptions, followed by a time for questions and answers afterwards. And the event today will be completed by 8:30 p.m. We're happy to be able to offer this special COVID version of the Woodland Conference series. For those of you who are regulars at our annual conferences, you may recall that we create agendas for each conference based on the feedback that we receive from participants like you. So we ask you to please provide feedback at the end of today's session. Okay, it's time to get the show started. So today we're fortunate to have three presenters who will each provide interesting and thought-provoking information in their area of expertise related to Mi'kmaq forest knowledge. Our first speaker will be Troy Robichaud. Troy is a senior research advisor with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq. Troy's presentation is entitled Mi'kmaq Forestry Initiative Netukulimk in Forestry. Welcome, Troy. The virtual floor is all yours.
Great, thank you, Don. As mentioned, my name is Troy Robichaud, and I'm the Senior Research Advisor at the Confederacy Mainland Mi'kmaq. However, my main role sees me coordinating the Mi'kmaq Forestry Initiative for the 8 mainland communities of the eight Mi'kmaq communities on mainland Nova Scotia. So today I'll be talking to you a little bit about the Mi'kmaq Forestry Initiative, a little bit about Netukulimk, and some of the work that we've been able to accomplish to date. So in short, the Mi'kmaq Forestry Initiative is a province-wide initiative that's actively working to develop and promote Mi'kmaq-led forestry and values. Right now, we are stewarding roughly 30,000 hectares of Crown land, which is under license. And with that, we are working to bring these forests back from their previous management structures into more of a Mi'kmaq Mi'kmaq forest, in trying to really promote, what that looks like in today's perspectives. With that, the Mi'kmaq Forestry Initiative is working to build capacities in the forest sector for and with Mi'kmaq communities. The Mi'kmaq Forestry Initiative is steered by a body called the Mi'kmaq Forestry Advisory Committee, which incorporates all 13 Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq communities. The committee is made up of staff from 3 main bodies, which are the Confederacy Mainland Mi'kmaq, representing all mainland communities, the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, which represents all 5 Unama'ki or Cape Breton communities, and the Mi'kmaq Forestry Initiative, which works very closely with the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs. Now, the first 2 on that list, CMM and UINR, are more of the technical bodies working most closely with communities and boots on the ground work, while KMKNO works most closely with the Assembly and providing legal support and really kind of steering the project from a more high level. The MFI is really guided through 2 main Mi'kmaq principles. The first, Netukulimk, which is a Mi'kmaq principle which really describes, utilizing the natural bounty of the earth, in this case in the forest, without really losing the integrity or taking anything away from 7 generations down the road. So it's very much in line with what Western science calls sustainability. And nswoods, or two-eyed seeing, is a principle which describes the utilization of Western science from one eye, as well as traditional knowledge from another eye. And together, we are to be able to be better guided through our practices and really encompassing all values and perspectives. Just for a little bit of context, the project really, or the idea of the MFI and the project really originated when there were some big shakeups about 10 or 12 years ago in the province regarding land holdings. The closure of Bowater Mersey Mill had left large swaths of provincial crown land unstewarded and under no license, as well as J.D. Irving in the western portion of the province kind of packed up and had left town, leaving large freehold amounts open and unmanaged throughout the province. So really, when these lands became available and were really had a large need for stewardship, the idea and an actual place for the MFI to take place came to life. And I guess the kind of the reinforcing movement which supported the MFI's development was Dr. Leahy's release of the Independent Review of Forest Practices in Nova Scotia in 2018, where he made some really strong recommendations that the Crown should enter a licensing agreement with Mi'kmaq, and that the Crown should really work to incorporate Mi'kmaq knowledge, values into their forest management frameworks, which we're starting to work and develop at today. So the result came a 3-year pilot project in 2019, with the Crown and Mi'kmaq entering a Crown Forest license agreement for 2 parcels of land, which I'll get to here in a moment. And we are working right now to add eastern lands to this as well. And currently we're working at a more long-term agreement, which encompasses a full swath across the province of lands to cater to all 13 Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq communities. And with this long-term agreement allows us to plan more long-term, where we all know, forestry is very much a game and a sector based on long-term management perspectives. So of the first 2 blocks which are encompassed in the license, there's the St. Croix block, which is in the St. Croix-Ellers House region, kind of northwest of Halifax, north of Highway 103 and west of Highway 101. And these lands were previously managed by Mersey Bowater. As you can see in the photo on the left, there's plenty of lakes and water bodies throughout here, and the land is quite fertile with great growing stock and great lit species throughout those lands, and really great habitat as well for hunting, trapping, fishing. And these lands have great access and are really in a great central location throughout the province for utilization. The second is the Digby block, which was previously managed by J.D. Irving and is roughly just under 8,000 hectares. These lands, like you can see again, have plenty of water bodies and water courses, which have been used and traveled upon by Mi'kmaq for thousands of years. It's nestled inland from the community of Bear River First Nation and is kind of northwest of the Tobiatic Wilderness area and Kwilmu'kwMaw-klusuaqnNegotiation National Park. And lastly, as I mentioned, we've been working to add an additional 10,000 hectares to our license, which we are calling the Eastern Lands, which are in eastern mainland Nova Scotia, as well as throughout Cape Breton. So starting off, just like any forest management company or organization, we really had to do a lot of groundwork on our planning to really, set forth in understanding and learning these lands, but as well as figuring out, what are the needs of the land. So we've developed a draft management plan for the MFI, specifically for the Digby and St. Croix blocks. Right now, with the Eastern lands just coming online for us, we're actively working right now to develop a management plan for Eastern lands. And from the management plan that was developed, we had a lot of assessments done, and we really had identified some low-hanging fruit as far as blocks that really needed to be catered to and were really suitable for merchantable and non-merchantable silviculture treatments. As I mentioned, there had been some heavy stewardship in the past from both Bowater Mersey as well as Irving. So it was really important that we not only utilize those lands, but as well as cater to them and ensure that we're doing good forest management and good ecological stewardship. And really, the point at the bottom, listening to the forest, has been a key term which has been kind of guiding us initially through our work so far. So our operations to date have consisted of commercial thinning, single tree selection, and irregular shelter woods, which many of you might know from the SGEM, as well as some higher retention type treatments. In the photo on the right is a single tree selection, which we had done on the St. Croix block in 2020. And as you can see, there's much vertical structure within the stand and really opening up stands to allow for that beautiful carpet of regeneration that you can see below to come up and allow for another age class, as well as a chance for biodiversity to thrive in these stands. And we've been really kind of toying with the opportunity to manage lands in a modern sense, and with modern equipment. And as you can see, there was a harvester and porter trail there, but learning the importance of brush matting and ensuring that our ground disturbances are always minimalized has been ways that we want to always the practices that we want to fold into our day-to-day operations to ensure that we're doing the best practices for the land as possible. Our other activities also include pre-commercial thinning. We've done an extensive amount, especially where these lands have been inherited from previous heavy managers. And lastly, road building and upgrading has been a major portion of our activities to ensure that we have sound economic access with trucking and things like that to really support our operations and reducing distances to mills. But as well as to improve access for communities for whatever uses communities might have from these lands. And really, as I mentioned, with the MFI starting in 2019, we really started off fresh as far as, as a business or a management entity. So in 2020, we entered a business development type project with Indigenous Services Canada and Natural Resources Canada, with that project being the Big Maw Forestry Strategic Partnership Initiative. And this business, again, is really focused on developing an entity, whether that be looked at from a business or a management perspective, but ensuring that we're doing our due diligence and foresight to ensure that sustainability from a business and economic perspective, but as well as social and environmental perspective, are all encompassed within our decision making, and really setting us up for success moving forward. So a lot of activities such as identifying governance structures and business planning has been at the forefront of the work since 2020, as well as we've been doing an extensive amount of community engagement. And as you can imagine, through COVID, that hasn't been the most easiest of activities, and we're really eager now entering these phases to be getting out in communities and getting communities out in the woods and having conversations and understanding what opportunities do they see for these lands. How might they be able to utilize them, whether that be for prosperity opportunities, teaching, economic activities, community activities, and really when we're getting community out on the land, we're learning and gaining guidance on how we should be doing our practices, and what we should be looking for when we're doing assessments or when we're looking to carry out operations. So some of the future opportunities and endeavors that we've been looking to dive into, of course, are primary and secondary production opportunities, mainly from timber. Carbon markets and climate forestry has been one of the markets that we're most eager to get into, where that really aligns with our climate goals and more long-term projections on trying to minimize our impact not only on the forest we're managing, but on the world as a whole. So carbon markets are really one thing that we're eager, and we're hoping that these opportunities can grow in our province, and we'll be continuing to strive for these moving forward. Forest management services has been one of those key areas that we think can be really well utilized for private woodlot owners, or even for some larger sector companies that might want to adopt or have our forest management services and perspectives carried out on their lands. So that's one area that we are still learning internally. How can forestry be carried out through principles like Netukulimk and two-eyed-seeing? However, understanding that there is likely a demand for that across the province, no matter who is stewarding or might own these lands. Non-timber forest products has been another exciting one that we're very eager to dive into. So we look at non-timber forest products as this beautiful chanterelle mushroom here, and being able to cater to restaurants or to local markets. And I think that's just one example and kind of the tip of the iceberg as far as goods and medicines and fruits which can come off of the land, but as well as ecotourism opportunities, hunting, guiding, fishing, any type of tourist or experiential service, I think is really of use for these lands with an abundance of land and water adjacent and within these borders. And lastly, branding and Mi'kmaq chain of custody has been one thing that we're looking at, of having Mi'kmaq-led management be carried out and hopefully have some secondary and tertiary production that is Mi'kmaq owned or Mi'kmaq-led, and really try and utilize that from the ground to an end product. We think there's some perhaps value added opportunities there. And we talk about these lands from kind of a prosperity and economic standpoint, but we want to acknowledge and put at the forefront that we are restoring a Mi'kmaq forest, and that we're honoring past, current, and future generations, and in trying to care for the forest in the way that it needs, and really listening to the care and the stewardship that it needs to thrive. Getting back to Netukulimk, we were doing some community engagement over the last 2 years, and we had a beautiful quote here from one of our elders, describing that the land only provides a certain level of life that it can sustain, and understanding what that level is, and what that quality of life can be supported by. We need to be looking at our forests in that regard. And less from kind of a profit margin driven perspective. We're still getting to learn the landscape, and getting community members out on these lands and getting what their perspectives and what their sites are on these lands has been really important, and is kind of something that has been pulling us back and making sure that we're going ahead in this step by step. And lastly, we want to ensure with communities that we're creating spaces to rekindle and have space for spiritual connection, ensuring that if there's customary practices, ceremonies, rituals, really anything that community might desire from these lands as a safe and equitable space, we want to be supporting those types of activities, and most importantly, facilitating and ensuring that values aren't overlapping, and that the activities of one the activities of one branch of the MFI and one perspective of how these lands might be able to be utilized isn't impeding on the success or the well-being of another value or another perspective. And really, lastly, I just want to touch on how these lands are opening up a larger conversation, and really this project is starting to ask and find answers towards some very interesting questions, such as what do Indigenous perspectives look like? How might they be applied on the landscape? How might they be applied in a forestry context? And when we are applying these perspectives, what are the doors that open? What are the doors that close? Really, where can we go with this? And how might we be able to integrate perspectives and create a better forest and a better world for 7 generations ahead? Acknowledging worldviews and second guessing and thinking about our assumptions, the way we make choices, the way we identify baselines and bottom lines. I think is a really interesting, and sometimes we kind of lose the forest through the trees. Of not taking a step back enough and thinking about the way that we perceive our forests, and taking that one step further and applying that to specific species. How might perspectives and how might prosperity be derived from our forest? If we're incorporating paper birch, ironwood, striped maple, for instance, what kind of products might they be able to derive? What role do they play in an ecosystem? So we want to ensure that everything and all of our relations are encompassed into our decision-making processes, and that everything has a place and a space to be considered. And lastly, one of my favorite kind of perspectives from this project is identifying what conventional forestry might consider, acceptable growing stock or AGs, or unacceptable growing stock or UGs, versus what a stand that might be able to provide an abundance of TP poles. From a conventional perspective, really long, skinny, softwood trees might not be able to, provide a mill with what they desire. However, eggs and nugs, from an eggs and nugs perspective, that can be completely reverted and looked at in a completely different way. So, I think with the activities of this project and kind of where we're going and way that prosperities can be looked at, I think is really we're setting a stage for not only opportunities but for different perspectives to flourish here. So Wilaliog, thank you all. If there's any questions, I'll pass it over to Don.
Excellent, Troy. Thanks very much. That was very interesting and very cool perspectives on things. A couple things while people are thinking of questions. You talked about public demand and getting the public involved in consultation, which is really tough during a pandemic, of course. But how do you determine what the public can do on that land? For instance, do you have to place limitations on, say, motorized versus unmotorized, extractive versus non-extractive? How do you set limits on what the public can do on those lands?
Where these are public crown lands, we want to ensure that, these are places and spaces for everyone. I think the main concern that we have is, just respecting the land and respecting spaces. And that can go from anything from, I don't think there's really any special context here other than, ensuring that there is access for everyone and there is a space for everyone. And respecting others in all context, I think is the number one here.
Right on. And what about training of the workforce? How, when, where will that occur?
That's something that we're still in the works with. And, I think with the changes going on in the sector as a whole and in the province as a whole, there is some great opportunities. We've been working with NSCC, Nova Scotia Community College, on their new forest innovation program. As well as we've been, keeping our ears open to different training programs, and really trying to utilize, the tools that are already out there and ensuring that our communities are plugged in and are exposed to those opportunities.
Okay, so that new program that's starting up at the Truro campus of the NSCC will be very much involved in that world.
Absolutely. And what we realize sometimes is, as the tribal council for 8 mainland communities, we can't always do everything, and that we need to, have these partners and really have them do what they do best and support, what our goals and objectives might be.
Excellent. And what type of long-term agreements would be ideal for you? What length
Really,
of term, I guess, yeah.
I mean, I can't really say anything to the length. I mean, obviously, the longer is the better, I would say. But the important thing for us right now is to ensure that, whatever communities' desires and whatever opportunities they might see for these lands remain open, and that, these lands can be understood as, a place of growing and, that we're just starting off. So really ensuring, again, that all opportunities and endeavors communities might see, that there's a space for that.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, I think that's right on time, Troy. So that was great. So thanks very much for your time and effort. That was a very interesting talk.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay. Our second presenter is Sherilyn Young. Sherilyn is a consultation project officer with the Forestry Consultation section of the KMK Negotiation Office. Sherilyn will speak about traditional Mi'kmaq uses on the land. Welcome, Sherilyn.
Thank you. As Don said, my name is Sherilyn Young, Deloise Sherilyn Young, and I work for Kwilmu'kwMaw-klusuaqnNegotiation. A little bit about myself. I am a consultation officer now with KMKNO, and I've worked there for approximately 2 years. Prior to, I was a forester. I was a forester for approximately 5 years, and I've been on the land for as long as I can remember as an avid hiker, harvester, forager, and hunter. Um, Today I will be talking about traditional use of Nova Scotia Mi'kma'ki and promoting traditional uses within forest management. In order to accomplish traditional use management, we practice Netukulimk in forestry. And Netukulimk is defined as the use, protection, and stewardship of the land and resources provided to all by the Creator for the sustenance and well-being of the Mi'kmaq Nova Scotia. As you may be aware, and as Don alluded to earlier, Nova Scotia is unceded territory. The Mi'kmaq have never sold or relinquished any land in Nova Scotia, and the Mi'kmaq have been here since time immemorial. My position at Kwilmu'kwMaw is intended to support consultation on projects which impact Mi'kmaq rights and title pursuant to the terms of reference for the Mi'kmaq Nova Scotia Canada consultation process. And this is specific to the protection of flora and fauna species. This includes, but it's not limited to, technical support to the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs and Kwilmu'kwMaw, project briefings, harvest reviews, forest-related projects, and site visits. And because we're talking about traditional use here today, I want to clarify that traditional use does not just mean that has been used in the past and is no longer used. While traditional use can mean that, it can also be used more loosely as a term, as in it's our Christmas tradition to hang a mistletoe. It's a traditional practice that occurs in the present. We're looking at, when we're thinking of areas of interest, of course, Nova Scotia is a very small portion of Mi'kma'ki, but we look at all three areas, urban areas, crown lands, and private lands. All of these have had and continue to have traditional use components to them. So some areas of interest may appear to be in very urban areas, like in downtown Truro or in Halifax, because prior to colonization, the Mi'kmaq were not designated to central locations or reservations. They were nomadic and they moved based on resource access. With respect to Crown land, and because my position is primarily focused on Crown lands, this is where we primarily focus our attention at this given point in time, simply because the Crown has a duty to consult in Nova Scotia. But that being said, Crown lands in Nova Scotia only make up approximately 30% of the working forest in Nova Scotia. The remainder is within private lands. And as for private lands, we're always very interested in private lands, because they make up of approximately 70% of the lands in Nova Scotia, and that's a huge component to forest management, biodiversity, and connectivity. We have an immense interest. Private lands have the potential to hold an enormous traditional use value, and even lands that have been intensively managed in the past can have some restorative value. So when we think of traditional use, we have been categorizing them under two very simplified titles. And so non-mobile traditional use and mobile traditional use. And once again, this is a very simple way to look at a very complex value. Some values may be categorized under both titles. For example, vegetation. However, with climate change, we know that our forested lands and our vegetation is changing. It's moving. So they fall under both categories. So first I'll touch on non-mobile traditional use. And this means that traditional use sites will not change. They continue to be used or have been used in the past. They have archaeological potential or all of the above. They may be ceremonial sites, ceremonial vegetation collection or item collection, sacred areas, some vegetation collection, burial grounds, camping grounds, and teaching areas. So I will not cover every single traditional use aspect within the province simply because there are just too many. But I would like to give a very simplified ground basis for what this may look like on a landscape. So some traditional use examples of non-mobile examples can be ceremonial sites. So this can include a particular area where smudgeon, which is burned in sweetgrass or sage, and passing the smoke over the body to cleanse the mind and spirit. And this is just a ritual that may be very simple or elaborate or private and collective, and may be designated to a specific location, or it may not be. Just to give you an example, I smudge every day just from my home, and that's not a very it's not a special area, but it's a special area to me. And then, of course, there is Maui-o-mi, which occurs at a traditional gathering places. This is a time of joy, reflection, remembrance, goodwill, and sharing. And it's also an opportunity to connect with the Great Spirit. I'd like to take you visually to a particular site. Say you walk in on a spongy sphagnum surface. The site might be a little wetter than desired, but there are dry, flat areas all throughout. You've camped here before. Your family has too. You look around and there's mist between the trees. You look beneath your feet, and there on the ground floor is gold thread, bunchberries, starflower, wild sarsaparilla, Indian cucumber, and wood sorrel. Kind of sounds like a good salad. So let's talk a little bit about the gold thread here. So gold thread takes a relatively long period of time to establish itself. And if left, gold thread can be next to a permanent structure on the landscape. It's important because of its medicinal properties. It's shade tolerant and is classified as a wetland species, but don't let that fool you. It can be found on dry sites. It's also not tolerant whatsoever to disturbance. So if there have been forested operations that have occurred in this area where gold thread once was, that gold thread is gone. It's no longer there. Now I mentioned the mist between the trees, but now the sun is showing. There is a shimmer of light reflecting off of a yellow birch, or golden birch, as I like to say. Mixed in is the reddish tint of beech and sugar maple and red maple. There's a scattered balsam fir. So let's talk a little bit about the trees. Yellow birch. It can live up to approximately 150 years, if not more. Yellow birch is important for its medicinal values, as well as the fungal properties that may grow off of it, i.e. chaga or birch polypore. It has been used as trail trees, and then it's also been used as tea. And the bark, well, not so much from yellow birch, but from paper birch, has been used for camp coverings and for drums for many different items. So for beech can live up to 350 years if allotted to do so. And I know it's pretty rare to see a nice healthy beech in the province of Nova Scotia with beech bark disease, but I have seen the rare few beech that are just absolutely enormous, and they will literally take your breath away because they are just so stunning. Beech also holds an incredible medicinal value. The winter leaves hold an antitoxin values when steeped in tree. So these would be your overwintering leaves that you can collect. These are the leaves that are still adhered to the tree. Sugar maple. So sugar maple, again, it's another long-lived species, 300 to 500 years if it has the correct environment. It provides a food source, shelter, it's been used for trail trees, and so much more. So this area that I just spoke of, that I asked you to go to, this between the medicinal value and the camping and teaching lands, it holds such a tremendous traditional value. So there's one more tree that I would like to speak about under this section because I have an interconnectedness with this tree. I've been dealing with this tree quite a bit. It's one of my larger files. And this tree is Wisco, or as you may know it as black ash. you may know that traditionally Wisco has been harvested by the Mi'kmaq for basket making, snowshoes, hockey sticks, etc. But what you may not be aware of is the immense medicinal value of this once tree. So this tree alone can treat several ailments from eye sores to respiratory problems. It's outstanding. In Nova Scotia, Wisco is a species at risk. So because of deforestation, whereby they only targeted commercial species to leave on the landscape, and because of predators, there hasn't been very much room left for this species. It has been thought that this species will only grow in wetlands, but I want to make it very clear that that is false. We have found Wisco in loamy nutrient sites that were certainly not wetlands. And I would like to say that it's somewhat of an opportunistic species, only it's not very shade tolerant. If allowed, it will grow in disturbed areas so long as it has a viable seed bed. It can be monoecious or dioecious, and it can reproduce asexually via stump sprouts or through fertilized winged seed. So once again, it's not a shade-tolerant species, which may be why it's more commonly found in wetlands. There's very little competition there. But all this means is that you may have walked past one in the forest as a forester or a forest tech without even knowing it, simply because you just would not expect to see it there. So some mobile areas include hunting and fishing areas, some vegetation collection areas, and ceremonial site collections. As I mentioned earlier, some vegetation may be non-mobile, but some certainly are mobile, especially when it comes to vegetation collection areas. There are many factors under consideration for a vegetation collection. Is it a food or medicine, the type of vegetation, and the seasonality of the vegetation? Or has your local area been disturbed or depleted by this type of vegetation? Or has this vegetation been impacted by climate change? In the pictures on this slide, the deer is meant to represent hunting, fish is meant to represent fishing, an eagle feather is meant to represent the ceremonial item collection, and the blackberry is intended to represent food foraging. These are all typical mobile sites for traditional use. So once again, I'm going to invite you to use your imagination. And let's just say you're out with your children or your grandchildren. There's a kraken in the forest west of you, and you know this area, so you know that that area had been harvested approximately 2 years ago. Quietly, you walk through the forested area to see the antlers of a great beast. An 800-pound bull moose is standing right in front of you. The moose is grazing on some spring foliage from a newly grown vegetation. Moose have been a rare sight on this land for years now, so you stop to take in the beauty of this animal. So let's talk a little more about the importance of moose. Mainland moose have been classified as endangered in Nova Scotia, and moose have provided much to the Mi'kmaq through the years, not only as a food resource or generally a resource, but also as a spiritual animal. The albino moose or spirit moose is a sacred creature by the customs of the Mi'kmaq. Other moose would traditionally be used for its hide, organs, meats, and antler. There wasn't much of this animal that was left to waste, if anything at all. It would be used as bedding, camp covering, food, clothing, toys, bags for transfer, decoration, jewelry, etc. I, in fact, have a pair of moose hide mittens, which I wear with pride, knowing that that moose was harvested sustainably from an area in which the population of moose is not in question. So deer being a smaller animal still represents some of the same values as moose do. So let's say this is your land and it's been used as for hunting and fishing for many years. Moose, deer, bear, minks, rabbit, etc. South of your property, sounds of a little stream. Trout exist here. The water is clear and fresh. This is your sustainability. This is your life. And this is what traditional use is. So what does Kwilmu'kwMaw-klusuaqnNegotiation and the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs support for forest management? I can say that we do not support low retention prescriptions, and those should only be done in very extreme circumstances, whereby the forest is being restored, like Troy mentioned prior to me. Heavy intensive forestry is also not supported. These types of forest practices are harmful to the environment, and they're not representative of Netukulimk. What we do support is high retentions of 50 to 70% depending on the site. And we ask that all forest operations leave a 50 to 80 meter buffer from the watercourses, because again, water is life, and watercourses themselves in that riparian area hold such an extreme value, especially through archaeological values. And Heather will speak a little more about that in the next slide. So you may want to know how you can manage a woodlot for traditional use on a landscape. And there are types of forest management that could promote traditional use. You just need to ask the right questions. Some will be very technical and some may be spiritual. What is right for your site? What type of niche does your site represent? What is the soil type, the wind throw hazard, etc.? Are you looking to harvest traditional use in the future? And what type of traditional use do you want to harvest and why? What do you value? Is it water, the riparian zone? Is it archaeology? Is it hunting, or is it foraging? What would have been on that site, on that land, prior to forest management? And does your site hold the correct niche requirements for the values that you want to see present? From experience, most sites try to return to their initial state. You may see a strictly planted Norway spruce stand with mixes of hardwood all throughout. There will be differences, of course, with climate change, invasive species, and intensive land management. Those will heavily impact what is existing within a forest in the present day and in the future. However, for the most part, we see stands trying to recover. Do you want to hunt on your land? Depending on what is presently there, you may wish to do some irregular shelter woods or patch cuts. Open them to stand up enough to provide that needed sunlight for fast-growing successional species. Your stand may be young, but you want a mixed wood forest that would have a high traditional use value. You could try a pre-commercial thin that targets to leave non-commercial species. If you want a timber and sustainability value, you could try a commercial thin or a individual selection. If you want to, for example, harvest for reishi or manage for reishi, which is a common name for a type of fungus that grows off of old hemlock, you may want to try a light touch forestry, again, in irregular shelter wood or commercial thin, to ensure that you have that continuous growth of hemlock within that stand. So it really all depends on your goals for that site. What you want to ensure, that you are leaving that you're giving back as much as what you are taking. So Walalio, thank you for your time here today. A lot of these pictures within this presentation were not mine, except for the one in the dead smack middle of my son holding some chaga. That was, like Troy said earlier, listening to the land. It's a teaching that I teach my son. I take him out into the forest with me often. My email is here and available. If you have any questions that you're not comfortable with stating here today, please feel free to contact me at any given point in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherilyn. Very interesting. Again, folks, to ask questions, you just click on the Q&A at the top right corner and then type in your question for Sherilyn. Sherilyn, for those that aren't aware, I mean, we've talked about this from time to time at conferences. Could you give a little blurb about chaga, please?
So chaga is a medicinal fungus that grows on a lot of different types of hardwoods. But its medicinal value really comes from when it's grown on birch, and specifically yellow birch or golden birch. Chaga can be grounded up and dried, or it should be grounded up and dried to prevent any type of mold growing within it. But it can be used. It's really quite incredible. It's beneficial for your skin. It's good for cancer or preventing cancer or aiding in it. It provides you with a ton of different types of vitamins, but it requires an older growth of white birch or yellow birch stands, and these areas have to be left undisturbed.
Thank you. That's great. I also enjoy chaga and like to spread the good word because it sounds too good to be true, but it is the strongest antioxidant or one of the strongest ones known to man, I understand, and has all those health benefits. So if you can
It
find some in
really
the
is.
forest. But I guess sustainability is one of those things, Sherilyn, that you have to be careful about when it comes to chaga or chaga.
That's right. So if you do happen to find a patch of chaga and you want to use that for yourself, never remove more than 2/3 of that chaga on the tree, and do not share your location. And once you share your location for that chaga, all of the chaga within that stand and within nearby stands will be gone, and it will be gouged right from those trees. So
And it's
keep
very
it
slow
private.
growing.
It's very slow growing.
And would you mind contrasting or just describing the fungus on hemlock? I'm not familiar with that one. What's the scoop on it?
Reishi, it holds the same values as chaga does, but again, it's a little bit of a faster growing fungus. It's more of a shell fungus, and it requires that old growth hemlock in order to grow. So it requires that type of forest.
Cool. So old growth, yeah. A question, how do you work with the forest industry to identify and protect indigenous values?
So again, my responsibility with KMKNO is, well, part of my responsibilities is to review harvest plans. So as they come into our office, and we sometimes receive a lot of polygons at once. We review these polygons through our current data sets that we have that allows us to identify whether or not they intersect with any known traditional use. On top of that, we also work with our Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq chiefs and some elders and council members to identify whether there's other areas of interest that we should be looking out for to ensure that those areas are protected as well.
Excellent. And Sherilyn, as you know, the majority of the participants here tonight are forest landowners themselves. So what would they want to do the right thing, and there's been a big shift over time in terms of focus on uneven age management and creating old growth and having some protected area, that sort of thing. What recommendations would you give to them as far as managing their land when they're inheriting or they have a certain condition that isn't that ideal forest?
That isn't that ideal for us, as in they have a lot of intolerant species on their
Yes,
stand.
exactly. The species aren't ideal. The young, intolerant, yes.
I would certainly, a lot of those young and intolerant species, they're also they may be fast grown, but they're also very short lived. What I would suggest is starting to plant an understory of long lived species that are also shade tolerant within the area. You
You
can
also,
set,
sorry, go ahead.
sorry. No, 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 you go ahead.
I was just thinking, you also mentioned about when you have a PCT stage stand about favoring some of the other species other than the planted tree too, I guess. Eh?
Exactly. You get a lot more value from your stand holistically as opposed to just industrial value. If you PCT for paper birch, for yellow birch, for sugar maple, but also keep those industrial species in there as well so that you can, if you want to have that timber value, you will still have it.
Okay, thank you for that. What is meant by the term trail trees mentioned in reference to sugar maple?
We will speak about trail trees in the next presentation that Heather is about to give.
Excellent. That's an excellent segue. Maybe we should move on from that. Well, Sherilyn, thank you very much for that presentation. Very interesting and gives us lots to think about. So thank you for that.
Well, all in, thank you.
Our final presentation is also by Sherilyn and Dr. Heather MacLeod-Leslie. Heather is a senior archaeologist with the KMK Negotiation Office. Their presentation is Forestry and Archaeology. The mic is all yours.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping that, can you just confirm for me that you can see my PowerPoint presentation?
Yes, you can.
Okay, super. Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much for inviting a little old archaeologist to participate. And I do have to say that working with Sherilyn alongside her at Kwilmu'kwMaw-klusuaqnNegotiation, I have learned so much about forestry. She's so knowledgeable. So thank you, Sherilyn, also for including me in your work here. So tonight, as your last presentation, Sherilyn and I will talk about archaeology and forestry. I've worked with Kwilmu'kwMaw-klusuaqnNegotiation for going on 14 years now. And I think I've learned as much in that time as I did in all the time I spent in school. In fact, I think I've learned more and more useful lessons sometimes. Okay, let's see. There we go. So, I just want to give a brief overview of what archaeology is. First of all, it has nothing to do with dinosaurs. And I say that a little tongue-in-cheek, but a lot of people do get it confused. That's paleontology that deals with dinosaurs and fossils, okay? Archaeology deals with people. So archaeology is the study of people from the past, who lived in the past, through the material culture or the things of their lives. So material culture can include things like artifacts and ecofacts, which are human impacts in the environment, but very specific and discrete things. So think of, carved wood, or maybe a patch of berries that's tended because that's a place you return to for harvesting. So that would be an example of an ecofact, where perhaps this blueberry patch is cared for. And it constrained and encouraged and so on over time. So artifacts are things that people make. Ecofacts are things that people impact in the environment. Features, I've got an example up here of features. So on the right-hand side is a picture of an archaeologist doing what archaeologists do, digging in square holes, and very good reasons for that. But you'll see, hopefully, on your screens that there's a patch of darker soil. And that darker black soil, and there's a little bit of reddish on either side and some brown. The dark black soil is actually the result of a hearth. And so that hearth feature, that the campfire, happened, maybe 1,000 years ago. So the fire's gone, obviously it's gone out. But the soil has been changed. There's ash in there and so on. And so an archaeologist can dig that up and they can keep the soil, but the hearth that was the campfire, it no longer exists because somebody's dug it up. So a feature is kind of like an artifact, but it can't be moved. And sites are kind of a whole bunch of artifacts and features all together. So if you imagine those places that people created, the houses, the yards, the places where they disposed of waste, things that got lost, things that got buried on purpose. So those are sites. And then, getting even bigger, a landscape might be a site. Maybe it's where someone lived, and maybe, there's a site where somebody worked, and in between there's space, but that space had meaning to the people who were living in one of those locations and going to the other location to work. That's part of their landscape. And just think about, where you go to the grocery store, where you go to the bank. You have this kind of idea of the landscape of your life. And so that's been that way since there were humans. And so archaeology also includes the patterns of all of these things and how they work together, those elements of material culture. So archaeologists dig up small areas, they dig small things out of big areas, they draw lots of pictures, they make lots of maps, they measure lots of things. And you'll see on the left-hand side of the slide a picture. It kind of looks like there's a brownie in the middle of a cake or a fudge layer. And those are what we call strata or stratigraphy. And that's basically like a vertical map of all the different layers of soils that have built up over time, either because people have dug holes, filled them in, changed things around, made post holes and so on. And maybe there's been river floods or trees have lost their leaves. They've, in the autumn, and they've built up that beautiful humus layer, and then 1,000 or so years goes by and all the minerals leach out of it because of the rain and more leaves fall. So that builds up that kind of stratigraphic record. So that's part of that material culture, that record. So the archaeological record is made up of all of the information. So it's the artifacts, it's the sites, it's the features, it's the ecofacts, it's the profile drawings. It's all those little measurements about how deep something was and what color the soil was. And a lot of information goes in to make up the archaeological record. But the thing is, the archaeological record contains biases because, of course, not everything that people use, not everything that people make survives in the earth. Things deteriorate, they rot. And thank goodness for that, because if you've ever been to a lobster boil, at a certain point, all the shells get thrown out in a couple of weeks or in a couple of days in the summer. That smells terrible. But if you go back 10 years afterward, well, it doesn't smell so bad. So the fact of the matter is the archaeological record is always incomplete. So we're always trying to understand the picture that incomplete puzzle is trying to show us. So it's never complete. We're missing puzzle pieces. And all of that information is interpreted. It's interpreted by archaeologists. It's interpreted by the people whose heritage it is. And the biases also mean some stuff is kept, some stuff isn't. And if we don't really know what something means to someone else, maybe we're not keeping the right things. In any case, something that I think is really important about archaeology for any woodlot owner to understand is that archaeological heritage is not a renewable resource. It is absolutely a non-renewable resource. And there's a lot of focus with respect to archaeology on artifacts. And if anybody's ever seen Indiana Jones, oh, that belongs in the museum. Well, that thing, that artifact, is about 5% of the story that we learn about the past. 95% of what archaeologists learn about the past through the archaeological record comes from the context. It comes from the relationship between all the little bits and pieces we find and the soil colors and the layers and so on. That context is really, really critical. And once that context and the archaeological record is gone, either disturbed or destroyed, we're never getting that story back. We're never getting those resources back. We're never getting those features back. So it becomes an opportunity lost. But archaeological heritage is a non-renewable resource. There are only so many. So why is archaeology important? People have, they make personal connections with their history, their heritage, their identity. Every human being does. And that sense of who we are and where we come from, and that's really important to our health. It's important for us to understand why things are the way they are now and where we've all come from. And that's really important for educating ourselves about how we function today, how things have come to be this way. Archaeology is very important for Mi'kmaq rights and title, and but as a whole, archaeology is an important source of information for everyone, because about the past, archaeology is the most democratic record that exists. Every single human being has the potential, and in fact does, leave an archaeological record. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. It doesn't matter if you can write or not. It doesn't matter if someone knows you're alive. You leave an archaeological record of your existence. And yes, by the time the archaeologists get there, it may be incomplete, but it is there. So unlike a lot of other historical understanding that relies on written documents, there are certain conditions that must be met in order for a historic record of a human being to survive. First of all, someone had to have been able to write. Someone had to have seen what was going on. And then that thing that was written had to have survived. Somebody had to want to keep it, seen value in keeping it, and then made sure that it didn't get, tossed in the fire or lost and recycled or anything like that. With archaeology, it's a whole lot more democratic. Every single person has the ability to leave a record of their existence. And so that's really important when we are trying to balance our understanding of the last, say, several hundred years here in Nova Scotia, between what has been written and the perspectives and the events that have been documented in the archival records, and what all the other folks were doing who weren't writing, who weren't the subject of the documentation. So some key facts that I would like you to remember from tonight about archaeology is that context is the key to understanding the physical evidence, and that the physical evidence includes artifacts and places, and that artifacts and places are tangible, but their values include intangible qualities. So by that, I mean that we can hold an artifact in our hands. We can go to a place. Even if it's been impacted, it's been changed, we can still go to that place. But the values that those things have are also intangible. You can't touch them. They may be spiritual, they may be emotional, they may be part of mental health. How many of us have been able to, I've got a couple pictures here. There's a picture of the ship Hector. So anybody of Scottish descent, a Nova Scotia Gael in Nova Scotia, will have an appreciation for the ship Hector as the first ship that arrived with Scottish immigrants for the purpose of settlement after the devastation of Culloden. There's also a picture of Evangeline and the church at Grand Pre. So anyone who is of Acadian heritage knows the importance of not just that there's a statue and a place to commemorate what happened here, but the emotion involved in the importance of that place and those events. And those values of those places, those things, are beyond the material. Artifacts and places are very important components of culture and heritage. There's so much they have to tell us that we've never heard before, if we simply have the opportunity to hear their stories. And culture and heritage, and therefore archaeology, are quite critical to identity and all aspects of health, including social, emotional, mental, and physical well-being. So that's all about archaeology. But what does that have to do with forestry, Heather? Well, so I'd like to share with you this map of Nova Scotia. The pink dots are recorded Mi'kmaq archaeological sites that are held within the provincial database. It is a protected database, and so the Nova Scotia Department of Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage maintains this database. And the orange areas are forest harvesting areas. So I've had a little patch zoomed in here. There's a long history of forestry harvesting in Nova Scotia. But as part of that commercial activity, there has been an utter lack of archaeological examination of those areas. There has never been a requirement for archaeological assessment prior to forestry. But we're hoping that will change, because as you can see in this area that's zoomed in, there's actually some MFI lands in here, the orange patch. And you can see that those are quite visible and all the pink dots are around them. And that is directly a function of the fact that there has not been archaeological assessment there. So we're exploring the parameters of what we can understand about archaeological potential in forestry harvesting activities, areas, excuse me, but there's kind of a black hole in our understanding. So we'd like to be able to say, well, we're pretty sure there's an archaeological site there. We really think there's an archaeological site there. So, be very, very careful. But the lack of prior archaeological assessment in forestry harvesting areas means that our understanding of where that potential exists is impacted, is skewed towards where people have found things previously outside of forestry areas. So, for instance, there's been a tremendous weight put on hydrology. Because we know that the larger rivers across Nova Scotia, this part of Mi'kma'ki, were essentially the 100 series highways. People traveled through the lands, traveled to meet their families, to harvest, to meet up with friends and family from afar, economic networks, trade networks, and so on. They all relied very heavily on the transportation of the hydrological corridors. However, people didn't just stick to the rivers. But because more work has been done on the hydrological networks, there's a skew towards thinking that that's where most of the archaeological potential exists. So for instance, in the zoomed in area, in kind of the bottom left-hand quadrant, you'll see almost a pink line with all sorts of archaeological sites identified. And that is the area of the Mersey River and Kwilmu'kwMaw-klusuaqnNegotiation National Park and National Historic Site. So there's been lots of archaeology done there. In the case of the Mersey River, much of the archaeology that's been done there is as a result of the Nova Scotia Power hydroelectric system, because there is development-driven archaeology happening there. So where people have looked, they have found. But again, please notice that this orange patch area of the MFI lands doesn't have archaeological sites recorded in it. And that's because we haven't looked there. It's not because there aren't any there. It's because there has not been any archaeological assessment in those parcel areas. So since we hopefully have a better understanding of some of the values of archaeology, that it's important to health, it's important to identity, it's important to know, have that opportunity to connect with our ancestors and our pasts, no matter who we are, no matter who we come from. I'm hoping that you'll understand some of the values that archaeology has beyond the fact that it is evidence of rights and title, and in a time where reconciliation is necessary. It absolutely is necessary. It's time to find those stories yet untold. There's a lot of finding of stories yet untold these days, and archaeological sites are no exception. So how do we know that if we looked there, we'd even find anything? Well, I'll share a little anecdote with you, or a little story. I have a friend who used to work for a very large forestry company in this area, and he spent decades. Now, he is a Mi'kmaq community member, and private collecting is illegal. It's not legal to pick up an artifact and keep it. But in days gone past, he, in the midst of all the forestry operations that he was part of over decades of his career, amassed a collection because he saw these archaeological sites being driven over, being unearthed. Now, I know forestry practices are different today than they used to be. The only reason I share that is that we know the sites are there somewhere. We just have to document them. We cannot protect and we cannot learn from the things that we haven't been able to access or find. So we know they're there, and we know we've lost a lot, and we'd like to not lose any more. We've lost contexts, we've lost data, and we've lost cultural legacy. And it's irreplaceable. Archaeology is a non-renewable resource. And because of the skew towards hydrological features, so rivers and lakes and oceans and coastlines, we have very little understanding of the patterns of use and occupancy in the thousands of years and hundreds of years prior to colonial settlement. So there's a real gap in our understanding. For instance, there's an under consideration in archaeological modeling of high elevated points for strategic things like hunting and defense. As an example, up on by Porcupine Mountain, actually, overlooking Cancel Causeway, just beyond that, there's a story documented in the archival record of Mi'kmaq on the shoreline waiting to launch for the porpoise hunt and waiting for the signal to launch the canoes to go harvest the porpoises, because there was somebody high up on the mountain precipice watching the waters, watching for the porpoises. And once that person saw the porpoises, they lit a signal fire, and that was the signal for the people down below on the shoreline to launch the canoes and go and harvest. So we know that high elevation points away from the water were being used strategically. Where those places all are, that's being masked by a lack of ability to study those inland and high elevation point areas, because there's this skew towards shorelines, rivers, and lakes. So, but remember, even though archaeology is not a renewable resource, there are no new archaeological sites growing underground, which is a good thing. So we want to find them, we want to document them, we want to learn from them and understand them. What are the signs that you may have an archaeological site, a Mi'kmaq archaeological site on your land? Well, that's where archaeologists come in. We look at landscape features. We look at soil layers and discoloration. We look for trail trees. We look for arranged and heat-altered stones. We look for the presence of artifacts, although ideally those are still below the ground. Sometimes you find them on the surface. If you do, please contact either myself or John Cormier of Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage, or Katie Cottrell-Robbins, who's the Curator of Archaeology for the province of Nova Scotia. Sometimes what we learn from in terms of where archaeological sites are to be found is from Mi'kmaq traditional use and knowledge, such as those non-mobile traditional use sites Sherilyn was talking about previously. And I will tell you that the two pictures that are on this slide are both in the middle of really important archaeological sites. These pictures are from Debert, Nova Scotia. And the Mi'kmaq ancestors lived here over 13,000 years ago when there were glaciers all around them. And we are looking at archaeological sites, but without the additional information and the additional understanding of where in the landscape you are and those soil layers that are likely below your feet, you're going to have a hard time finding exactly where the archaeological site is. But these two pictures are two pictures of archaeological sites. Hugely important among the three oldest archaeological sites in North America. Really, really important sites. But what you might be able to find are the traditions of trail trees that mark the landscape. And as foresters and woodlot owners, you would probably be more likely to encounter those. So I'm going to hand the mic to Sherilyn for the next two slides to talk about trail trees.
Well, Ellen, Heather, thank you. Every time Heather speaks, I learn so much. So a trail tree falls under the broader scope of a culturally modified tree. And these trees are trees that have been altered by Innu for the purpose of traditional use. So trail trees are intended to find a specific value, such as a direction to fresh water, medicinal crop, spiritual areas, or other sites of significance. And they may have many names, including trail trees, thong trees, or as my grandma liked to call them, prayer trees. And I think the reason why she called them prayer trees is because she used them to find her ceremonial site, her prayer site. It's important here to note that there are many different types of culturally modified trees throughout Canada and the United States of America. Modifications can include strip bark, scar trees from plank removal, delimb trees from wood harvest, or other types of modifications associated with traditional uses. This slide, however, will be focusing specifically on trail trees that have been found within Eastern North America, including a long-lived tolerant wood species. And these species include sugar maple, red oak, but rarely spruces. Occasionally, some trail trees will be slightly intolerant or short-lived species, such as poplar, for example. I want to note that non-Indigenous people or non-Innu also, such as early settlers, have also altered trees as part of a taught practice. This does not make these culturally modified trees found in the field any less significant. So Mi'kmaq and other Indigenous groups have taught early settlers their methods in finding direction and considering that Tuaitian is a useful and evolutionary method of grown as a nation. I'm sorry, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback, and I'm not sure if you can hear me just fine. Can you let me know if you can hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So the classification of a trail tree. So because trail trees are living artifacts, and I don't believe I've stated that yet, but trail trees would be considered living artifacts. Natural and unnatural mortality is inevitable. So the shape and form may vary depending on the age of the tree and the artifact. However, there's a few key characteristics displayed by most trail trees. So if you take a look at this picture, this is a picture that I took while working out into the field, and this is a trail tree. And what you might notice within a tree, and I'm moving my cursor as if you can see it, but there's a hip, a nose at the very tip. It's kind of bulges out where moss would have been packed in, or charred bark. Thank you, Heather. And there's also a horizontal bowl or multiple horizontal bowls. Or sorry, one horizontal bowl and multiple upright bowls. So this tree here, it will stand out to any forester or any woodlot owner that is walking in the woods. It's very eye-catching when you see it, and it took me out of the stand that I was assessing. So east of this particular tree and in the direction the nose is pointing, there was fresh water courses and a neighboring lake. So the trail tree is situated on a mountain or a hill that's surrounded by moderate to a poorly drained site. And it was likely untouched in previous harvest due to the unsuitability of the site. So if you think you've encountered a trail tree, some of the things that you can do is contact our office or myself directly, but make sure to include a geographic reference as in a UTM coordinate. Include pictures as well, because trees can have irregular shapes for many different reasons. And so by including a picture, it's relatively easy for us to confirm whether or not what you are seeing is a trail tree or a tree that has just been through some trauma, like snow press. Next slide, Heather. I'm noting the time, so I'm trying to go pretty fast. Forest management. When it comes to archaeology and forestry, some provinces are way ahead of Nova Scotia. For example, British Columbia has its own guidelines for archaeology and forestry. Ontario as well has their own guidelines. However, the guidelines that they have developed and provided for their provinces may not work for this province. We have to consider that in some areas our soil or organic layer is relatively shallow, too many ors. However, some areas may have deeper organics or soils. We're hoping to develop a collaborative project in which archaeology will play a larger role in forestry, like Heather mentioned prior to. But like everything else, this will take time. So in the meantime, some factors to consider when harvesting on an area with archaeological potential are the time of the year, the type of equipment, and the type of forest management that you may wish to proceed with. So for time of year, harvesting in the winter when the ground is frozen and there is significant snow cover, this will do significantly less damage to the ground and therefore to the artifacts underneath the soil. Avoid harvesting in early spring or in the autumn when the weather is changing and the soils are soft. Excuse me for just a second. When considering types of equipment, I've seen both tracked and wheeled equipment cause rutting or quite severe rutting on forested grounds. Considerations include overall machine weight and load distribution. So the lower the machine weight and load, the better. Don't overload your skidder because this will concentrate the load or the weight to the rear of the skittle or to the rear axle, which will create larger ruts. And when selecting a skidder, choose one with as long of a wheelbase as possible. This will ensure a balanced weight distribution between the axles, and it will reduce the shifting weight from the front to the rear when it's loaded. As for forwarders, the wider the machine track width and the lower the load height, the more balanced the load distribution will be from one side to the other during travel. And some types of forest management. This is really going to come down to choosing a type of forest management that's best to the site. And this is something that's the SGEM can speak more about, as well as our Netukulimk manual, which we're hoping to hoping to have out relatively soon as well. So if we know the site is prone to wind throw, choose a high retention operations, commercial thins, patch cuts, or irregular shelter woods. You want to ensure, especially in these areas of high archaeological potential, that you have continuous cover and you are not disturbing that root base. You may also want to consider yarding a little further because this will aid in the reduction, again, of ground disturbance. Consider brush mats. Brush mats are your friend when trying to prevent ground disturbance. I love brush mats. I preach brush mats. Troy can speak to that. Many other foresters that I've worked with can speak to that as well. And finally, if this isn't the first time harvesting this forest, use the same trails that you have used before or prior to. So same Yarden trails, same Holland trails, etc. That's all I have.
Got one more slide for you. Can you hear me, Dawn?
Yes.
Okay, good,
Perfect.
good. So, Sherilyn, thank you very much for that. So, a trail tree is a perfect example of an eco-fact. And those are the ones that you are probably most likely within your lands going to encounter if you are currently unaware of some archaeological potential or cultural potential. The other thing that I want to say before I go into all of the content of this last slide is, Sherilyn, thank you so much for discussing disturbance. So for an archaeologist, any shifting of soil, including, say, a tree that falls down in the wind and rips up the roots, that's disturbance for an archaeologist. So even the low disturbance methods, when I hear heavily tracked or treaded vehicles, my heart starts to pound a little bit, but not in a good way. So the idea of disturbance, remember all of those layers of soil and all the measurements and so on that archaeologists take, and that context is 95% of what we learn from. It's 95% of the story that we can learn. So any type of disturbance will hamper our ability to learn that story, and for those people who left this record to have their voices heard. So disturbance is a thing. And of course, yes, we'd love to know if you have your own local and traditional knowledge about archaeological sites potential. For our purposes, we're interested in Mi'kmaq archaeological sites, both ancient and historic. But then the Department of Communities, Culture, Tourism, and Heritage with the province of Nova Scotia would be interested in all archaeological sites, not just Mi'kmaq. So where would we like to go from here between archaeology and forestry? And Sherilyn quite rightly pointed out that, we'd like to be collaborative, okay? Currently, we are using existing data to assess archaeological potential. And we've said time and again that this is not our comfort level. We would like to better understand where the archaeological sites are in those blank spots in our understanding where forestry activity or no archaeology has happened previously. Because the data are skewed. That doesn't mean that they're not useful, but we don't know the degree of skew that there may be. And Sherilyn talked about the trail tree on the high point. Again, we've got high points, and we know that a lot of the archaeological assessment has skewed towards lower lying hydrology. So we have a lot to learn in archaeology from foresters and private woodlot owners, and there's an opportunity for us to learn together. We would like to see on-site archaeological assessment in certain areas with acceptable levels of risk and sensitivity. So what I mean by saying that is, right now we're looking at areas that have high potential for archaeological and cultural sensitivity, moderate levels of archaeological and cultural sensitivity, and low. Never know, because if we just don't know, but maybe a lower potential. And in areas that are not so sensitive that forestry can occur, we'd like forestry to be able to occur, but we'd like not to lose any more stories or any more archaeological sites. We're really looking for a coexistence of archaeology and forestry. And I think, the sky's the limit in that there's a great deal of willingness to work alongside business, development-driven archaeology. That is archaeology that happens because somebody wants to do a project that's not archaeology. So this is not Egypt we're talking about. This is where people are getting ready to build things or do new land uses. So this is development-driven archaeology or contract archaeology. That probably accounts for about 97% of the archaeology that happens on the planet Earth now. The days of Lord Carnarvon and Egypt and tombs and so on, that is long past. So when archaeologists are doing archaeology now, yes, there are square holes that get dug sometimes, but it all starts out with a walk in the woods. And then maybe some interest in shovel testing to get some of that subsurface information. What do the layers under our feet look like? Is there archaeological potential here? And then if there is, then we roll up our sleeves and we say, okay, now where exactly is it if it's here? Remember, there's no new archaeological sites growing underground. So if you have archaeological assessment on your lands done by a qualified permitted archaeologist, once that's done with appropriate methods, further assessment is not likely if they didn't find anything, because there are no new sites developing. So we would like to have this coexistence. We would like to update the archaeological assessment tools to better reflect forestry harvesting areas, so that we can compare apples to apples. And the only way to do that is to do something we've never done before, and that is archaeology in advance of forest harvesting. Even if the archaeological record is impacted by prior forestry activity, that doesn't mean that we can't put those puzzle pieces together. It might be a little harder. We might have lost a few more pieces of the puzzle, but that's what archaeologists do. They try and rebuild that picture, that whole picture, with as few pieces as possible, so that those stories that are yet untold by the people whose stories were not written, and there are millions of people who have lived whose stories were never told, that's what we want to learn. That's what we want to hear from. And the only way that's going to happen in forestry harvesting areas is if we collaborate. That's what reconciliation is about. We all move forward together. So with that,
And
I
Heather,
would like to say Lalio. Yes,
I
Sherilyn?
just want to echo that statement that you made. It all starts with a walk in the woods, and I think that's what we're here today discussing. We're all very passionate about the forest, and we just want to see the best. We just want to do the best that we can do with the forest that we have here in Nova Scotia.
Agreed.
Well, thank you very much, Heather and Sherilyn. Very interesting. Now, Heather, I can't let you go without asking a couple of questions here. So you mentioned very clearly that the archaeological assessments have been, it's not very intensely done across the province. There's many, many areas that haven't been done yet. Is there a trend that most of them have been done on Crown or private land, or is it hit and miss in terms of land ownership?
Archaeological assessment?
Yes.
No, we're working toward archaeological assessment on Crown lands. And that is still a work in progress. There's a lot of discussion that's happened over the last, I would say, 6 years. Well, no, that's not true. I'm not a math expert. Since 2013. Okay. Oh my gosh, time goes quickly.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so discussions have increased on how to do that in a feasible and effective way, because and that's why I say appropriate methods. There's no sense in doing this, half cooked, um, because then we're no further ahead. Then we've spent money with nothing to show for it. So those discussions have been focused on Crown lands, but on private lands and outside of forest industry, be it Crown or private woodlot, um, archaeological site evidence is yielded everywhere. Um, Someone's garden. In fact, I can think of 3 gardens just popped into my head right now, uh, where when they hill up for their crops in the spring, and this is just a household garden. Please move your household garden because you keep putting it on an archaeological site. But then also larger industrial landscapes like the Mersey River. So it's not, while the discussions thus far have been focused on Crown lands as opposed to private lands, we still have yet to make the progress that we need to make there.
Okay.
We're still running a significant deficit of information.
And the ones that have been done in the past, is there a trend whether they were on Crown or private land, or is it sort of helter-skelter?
You mean archaeological assessment on forest harvesting lands?
Sorry, no. The map that you showed, where it showed where they're distributed across the province, and so many
Oh,
areas that haven't been. Is there a certain percent on Crown and private, or is there a trend that way? Land
uh,
ownership?
no, I would say the vast majority has been on private land. I'm sorry, I misunderstood your question. I was
No,
going
it's
to say
okay.
that the history of archaeology on forestry lands is only less than a year old.
Right,
Um,
right.
but no, private land ownership for industry certainly has driven a lot of the archaeological understanding,
Okay.
as opposed to crown lands.
Okay, thank you. And here's a comment here I think you'll be interested in hearing, and maybe you know this gentleman. It's a comment, not a question. He says, I do similar work for Algonquin communities in central Ontario within the treaty area. All forest management plans must now include legal protections / prescriptions for Indigenous values, such as canoe-grade birch trees, culturally modified trees, stone markers, petroforms, campsites, areas of archaeological potential, spiritual sites, etc. Also, we train forestry operators and private woodlot owners to recognize, protect, inform communities of these locations. Interesting.
Oh yes, there's no question. Those other jurisdictions are light years ahead of Nova Scotia. It's it's a tough one. It's a real tough one because every season we lose more.
Right.
Every rut we lose more, and we never get those back, ever. This is a one shot. If we mess it up, it's gone. So it is desperate, and there's a lot that gets lost, and we never get it back.
Well, thank you. You've made a very clear message throughout, and I want to take this opportunity, Troy, Sherilyn, and Heather, on behalf of the webinar organizing committee and all those out there in the virtual world intently watching their computer, and those that will be watching it in the future weeks, Walalin, for your time, effort, and interesting presentations on subjects that most of us would have previously known relatively little. So this was really worthwhile, and thank you. And of course, because of the fact that we are virtually together today, we're unable to personally present you with a thank you gift on behalf of all of us. However, you'll soon be receiving a container of a popular non-timber forest product and a favorite sweet treat, maple syrup from Rosebriar Farm of Carroll's Corner, and we'll track you down to get it to you. So thank you very much to the 3 of you. And folks, this brings us to the end of another session. As mentioned earlier, our next Woodland Conference event will be our series of 3 in-person conferences, April 2nd in Millbrook, Colchester County, April 23rd in New Ross, and April 30th in Port Hawkesbury. You're welcome and invited to attend. The full conference webinar mini-series schedule can be found on the nswoods.ca website, as I mentioned earlier. Again, we'd like to thank our 3 speakers for making this event meaningful for all those who tuned in today, as well as those that will see it in the future. Finally, please provide your feedback in the exit survey so we know what you think of this and what you'd like to see in the future. Help us plan for future conference events. To do this, before you close down your browser, just click on the Leave Event to get to the exit survey, which takes 1 to 2 minutes to complete. Your information will be kept private and not used for any promotional or commercial purposes, we promise. If for some reason you aren't able to complete the exit survey, simply go to the nswoods.ca website and email the request to have the exit survey emailed to you, and we will do so. Well, that's it for now. Sorry to keep you a little late, but I think you'll agree it was worth it. Great information and a great night, and 3 really strong speakers with great messages, so we really appreciate it. So we hope that this was worthwhile use of your time and that you learned a lot. We look forward to our next session and hope to connect with you then. Thanks, and take good care of each other. Bye for now.